Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of Death Space Filling the Void. I don't know if it's coming through, but you can hear the fireworks going off here in South Carolina. People are getting excited for the 4th of July. Between Thanksgiving and 4th of July, my favorite holidays. Because there's not much to do but to sit around and eat and drink, and I like that. You know, there are activities if you want there to be activities. But you really just hang around outside. It's July, the weather's amazing. People are blowing things up. You're eating hot dogs and hamburgers. The grill's going. There's beers going. Whatever you want. It's terrific. It's the best. And then most of the time, you're asleep by 10 o'clock. The past couple of weeks, I've been trying to wake up a little bit earlier. Yeah, notice how quickly I am to mention that on the podcast. But I've just been finding myself a little bit overwhelmed between the two podcasts and having a full-time job and just the subject matter. And by starting my day a little bit earlier, get more done. I've also been trying to do a little bit of yoga in the morning, and it certainly helps. You know, it's the summer, right? So it's much easier to wake up early when the birds are chirping and it's like 75 degrees already. Come talk to me when it's cold. For this week's interview, I have Steff King. I guess I should preface this that most of the interviews that have already played on the podcast, I recorded, let's say, from April or May of 2020 through January of 2021. I was just trying to figure out the show. I think I've mentioned this, and in the meantime, I was recording a bunch of episodes because I was excited. And then once this backlog is done, I'm going to start recording new ones. But I got a message from someone named Angelica on Death Space Filling the Void's Instagram, which I have to say, the messages I have received of people sharing with me their stories of grief and how the podcast has affected them has warmed my heart so much, and hopefully the podcast is making a positive impact. Angelica reached out to me about a study that they're conducting. A bunch of students are conducting two different studies, actually. One is for mortuary staff in British Columbia, Canada. And it's basically about whether mortuary staff are getting help from the government and how they're handling the extra workload, unfortunately, due to COVID, and how they think things may change in the future, how they could increase capacity in a safe way. Are they holding funerals? Are they able to hold funerals and wakes and traditions like that? And the other study is related to bereaved. You know, COVID, like I was saying about the other study, has taken away funerals and wakes in a lot of cases, caused people to handle the death of a loved one in a different way. And so the study intends to look at what that does to people, how that affects them. How does that change your grief process? Do you feel like you didn't get a chance to say goodbye as you intended to or would have liked to? And then so it's like, how do we help those people who feel a little bit lost? Because these traditions are there to help us transition from the shock through saying goodbye and into moving forward. And what happens when that transition period is different or gone? I got excited talking about the studies themselves, but Angelica connected me with Steff King, who's the head researcher on these two studies. Steff is a master's student at Simon Fraser University. And so Steff and I had a conversation about the two different studies, what they hope to get out of it. And Steff also spoke about how death investigations in Canada and throughout North America related to indigenous communities can be lackluster. And so we dove into that a little bit as well. So let's start moving our way over that interview. As always, if you're liking the show, please remember to rate and review it. Super helpful. And to check the show out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm just going to make that mistake every time now, I guess. Death Space Filling the Void. And thank you so much for listening. let's send it over to Steff. Enjoy. Joining me now on the podcast is Steff King, who is a master's student in criminology at Simon Fraser University. Is that all right, Steff?
Yeah, that's perfectly right.
Nailed it. I was just describing to Steff how typically mess up the intros and kick it over to the guest to clarify, but that one, hey, I'm off to a good start.
Right, exactly. Most people have such long titles, so I mean, I'll keep it
Nice
easy
and
for you.
easy. Yeah. We connected after someone on your research team, I forget her name, reached out to me about a study that you're working on there. Can you tell me a little bit about the study and what you're looking into?
Yeah, definitely. So it's a sort of amalgamation of a lot of conversations with the research team and a series of events, as most research is. But essentially, just to give a little bit of context on how it all started. So we're ultimately interested in how COVID has impacted death management practices. And that takes up a variety of different things. But at the beginning of when COVID traveled to sort of British Columbia, Vancouver sort of thing, because it took quite a while for it to get to us, we started seeing some very interesting news stories about how death management practices were being impacted by COVID. And so naturally, because our research team, we come out of the Center for Forensic Research at Simon Fraser University, we started looking at the deceased, because that's what we do all day, every day in all of our research. We have people who work with death investigations, with victim services, we have entomologists. I used to work in a mortuary, so started looking at these things, and there was an article that came out from the US, and it said that mortuary homes and funeral homes were being overwhelmed by the deceased that were coming from COVID. And so they had to start outsourcing to refrigerated trucks from grocery stores. So I imagine no one likes to think of, like, if they see their grocery store refrigerated truck going by, nobody likes to imagine that there might be deceased people in there. But this is sort of the things that had to start changing because COVID was increasing the amount of deceased that we were getting. So our research launched from that. We kept talking about how all the things that could be affected by COVID. So
Sorry to cut you off. Just to clarify, when you say death management, is that, okay, we have X amount of bodies coming in, it's sort of, for lack of a better way of thinking of it, is more like a factory has things coming in and they have things coming out. Like, I realize that's very cold, but like that's the essence of what you're describing.
Yeah, essentially. So death management practices for like mortuaries and funeral homes specifically will be the whole kit and caboodle. It's like taking them up from wherever their final resting place was. So the collection, processing the deceased and however is expected, whether that be some still had to have autopsies, some might be embalmed, all the way to the final death rite ceremony, so the funeral and the wake, and then putting them either in the ground or cremating them. So the whole in and out process.
Okay.
Is recovering.
Got
Yeah.
it. Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot that goes into that. And
Yeah.
our study will continue because we need to get all those pieces. But for our purposes now, we've segmented it into two different parts. So we have two surveys going out that's open for the public to sort of click on or investigate in. But the first survey asks specifically mortuary and funeral home workers how their practices have changed since COVID. So we asked them everything from, how many people could you hold before COVID, and have you been overwhelmed since after that, or have you had any support by the federal government for protective equipment, PPE, or how have you ensured the safety of your workers? Because at the beginning of COVID, we weren't sure how long COVID lasted in the deceased, and our staff are always interacting with them, and if it's being aerosolized, then that's putting them at risk of exposure as well. Yeah, and that's actually a huge concern of most of the people we're talking to right now is we have a lot of conversation about essential workers who are usually first responders or hospital staff, but it doesn't include mortuary and funeral staff, and they're at the same exposure to risk during these times, still having to pick up the deceased. They don't know if they have COVID or not. Most of the time, they're not informed. So that's one of the main things we wanted to find. That's the first survey. And then the second part is looking at the bereavement, because death is a very personal experience. There's a lot of mourning and grief that comes with that, but in order to protect mortuary staff and to protect the families, we saw a lot of alterations or banning of death rites ceremonies. So funerals, wakes, the whole
Mm-hmm.
9 yards. And so we launched a second survey out to anyone who identifies as bereaved during COVID. So they lost someone during the COVID pandemic times. It's kind of a loose timeline. They don't have to die of COVID, just a death. And in the survey, we asked them, were you able to have a funeral? If not, how did that affect you? How did you interact with staff? Were you able to go through your grief process naturally, or was it held up by COVID? So we have these two different elements going out right there, going out knowing that death management is complex and it's being quite disrupted at the moment by COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll share with you that I lost my grandfather during COVID, not to COVID. And it was really hard for obvious reasons, but then it was hard because there was that other level of anxiety and concern that we had a funeral and there were people there, and at times people were hugging, and so that seems like that's part of your study. I mean, I felt like I had to seek out time to grieve because my anxiety was kind of blocking it. Yeah, I feel like that's very important to kind of understand how because that's not like an apparent way, right? Like that's not obvious until you're in that scenario. So I applaud that happening, because I feel like a lot of people are going to be they're grieving in different ways and feel like they didn't get the full chance if they didn't have a funeral. And so I'd definitely be curious about your results. Are you able to share anything that surprised you, or is it, I don't want to put words in your mouth?
Yeah, so we're still in data collection right now, so we haven't sort of, searched through what we have too meticulously, but generally what we're finding is that overall people are being affected negatively, whether they're the staff or the families, and that they don't know where to turn. We have people who have lost loved ones. They couldn't have a funeral, but I mean, they can't complain to anyone. This isn't something that's somebody's fault. It's just the way that it is. And there really aren't, because these conversations aren't happening regularly, there aren't the resources for them to sort of get out that anxiety or to have a proper death rites ceremony that makes them feel fulfilled in that grief process. So yeah, generally we're finding a lot of people who are frustrated, and we're hoping that our results, in whatever the complete form that they are, that we can get them published and presented out to these professional realms so we can start getting attention and action on those things. So,
do you fear the spreadsheet? Phobia begun. I don't know why I did that voice, but it felt like fun. Today's episode is brought to you by My Software Tutor. My Software Tutor offers 3 levels of real-time Zoom-based courses with a live instructor. Someone to hold you accountable, right? Like you didn't just flip through your Creative Cow video or YouTube video that's teaching you stuff. There's a live instructor making sure you do your stuff. And they all deliver practical, functional business skills in a friendly, supportive environment. Friendly and supportive, as I just made them sound like a drill instructor. They're not. They want you to learn. These courses will increase your marketability, whether you're an employee, job seeker, consultant, or contractor. And they know they're going to increase your marketability because they're going to watch over you. The live instructor's going to be all over you, like, I think his name was Mr. Hand from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. You think you're going to prom? No, you're going to learn this stuff. Kidding. Register at mysoftwaretutor.com and use promo code POD20 to save 20% off all registrations. Are you missing your friends? Tired of unwinding in front of the TV? Today's episode is also brought to you by Garnished Entertainment. Losing your marbles ever so slightly? That line makes me think of Hook. Just yucking it up about losing your marbles. Shake up your night with a Garnished virtual cocktail event. Garnished Entertainment is a New York City-based mixology event company with the mission of bringing communities together through creative and entertaining virtual cocktail classes. I used to not really be a big cocktail person. Jamie, my girlfriend, got me into them a bit more. It's wonderful. It's terrific. There's usually some colors involved. There's a nice garnish. Everything is beautiful. It's got some good taste. I think if it wasn't for Jamie, I just would have had Bud Lights and then died. You know, like eventually, not because of the Bud Lights, but just would only choose Bud Lights and then, it's nice to not be such a Neanderthal. Whether you're catching up with old friends, team building with colleagues, or looking for the perfect date night, Garnished would love to be your host. Let's garnish. And on top of that, you just don't want to be a Neanderthal. You want to broaden your horizons. All right, let's get back to Steff. What are some actions that are possible depending upon the results? I'd imagine there'd be, one channel going one way. If based on the results, gosh, that was going to be such a long explanation of me. I'm glad I pulled up the reins there. But yeah, what are some actions that you guys are talking about and considering?
Yeah, so there's a variety at the moment, since I think we've been looking for participants for quite a while now, but we're going to just keep pushing it back until we get a good amount of the sample. But we've got 3 different graduate students on our research team, so we're at least looking for 3 different publications in different realms, so we can reach 3 different places where there might be practitioners or academics or people who can continue the conversation. So publications is the first level, reports, getting the information out there so somebody can do something with them. The second is also holding these results and these conversations in a professional realm and like a presentation. So academic conferences, places where we have practitioners where we can actually, put the heat on them a little bit, like face to face, because you can't get rid of us if we're right in front of you telling you what's wrong. Like,
right.
That's the first wave on what we're looking for generally, is just get the information out there. And then once it's out there, we can kind of come back, decide what's best from there. Do we need to try and get this to be something that's more of like a policy influencer, or is somebody going to pick it up and ask us questions or something like that? And then there's always the opportunity after we get the final results to see where we're missing information or where information needs to be addressed that we haven't thought of, and then launch extra studies to keep going from there, because it is a little under the radar at the moment.
Certainly. And how long do you intend these 2 surveys to run for?
So at the moment, we have it going all the way to just August 2021, so a few months from now. But we recognize that COVID does not abide by deadlines or strict timeframes. So we are always pushing it back if we decide that, we have responses, but we could get a few more. So it might get extended back a few more months at a time, but August for now.
Okay. And where can people find the surveys?
We have the work study students who I think talked to you to find you. So they're putting links out everywhere in my chat rooms and all of these sorts of things. But usually what we do is we find someone who's willing to take our survey link and post it out, and then people can just click the link and then take the survey from wherever. So it's floating around at the moment. We don't have an actual hub where it sits, just whoever wants it. I'm happy to give you the links as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely post it on Death Space Filling the Void's social media.
That would be awesome. Thank you for, really anyone who wants to take part in that. It's for mortuary staff, it's for the bereaved, or everyone in between. So
yes, well, so everyone, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's great. Yes, I'll definitely do that. Well, you also mentioned you are studying criminology. My TV focused brain jumps right to CSI and CEI, different shows like that. Is that kind of spot on? Like, you're in there with Dexter and the whole crew down there in Miami?
It would certainly make life a lot more interesting. I think we're all missing that like central drama from a TV show that we were all hoping for. You definitely get a lot of, because as a graduate in the program, you like you're a teaching assistant, you teach undergraduate students who are just coming into criminology, and that's the first thing they always ask: when can I meet Dexter, or when can I,
Yeah.
get on the crime scene? It's actually very different. Like that's how we lose most of our students. Like, oh no, I don't get a cool name and can do
I don't
things.
have a TV show with like, 5 friends and we're solving crimes and
Right,
they want to be Scooby-Doo.
right, exactly. Yeah, and so the rest of us, so my research team essentially are all the ones that have accepted that Scooby stays at home while we go and do the things that take a little more time and a little more funding. But I don't know. It generally it's made up of so many different parts that when you see in a show somebody who is, I don't know, investigating the case, also supporting the victims, making arrests, doing all the forensic analyses, like that's just not how it works. We have people who have like specific jobs within the criminology department that take like a small piece of each of them. So even within our research team, we have someone who's looking at Canadian law and victimology, so miscarriages of justice. We have somebody looking at aquatic taphonomy, so how people decay in the water.
Mm.
Our supervising faculty member, Dr. Gail Anderson, is a well-known forensic entomologist, so how insects eat the dead, like all
Mm.
these fun little parts. And then I, of course, look at death investigations for indigenous populations, which has a whole nother rabbit hole that goes down there in terms of ethics and forensics and stuff.
Well, let's go down that rabbit hole if you're comfortable a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious how criminal investigations are different for indigenous
Mhm.
populations.
Yeah, so I mean, this is pretty generalizable from
Sure.
Canada to the US to, North America, but it's kind of what I think most people will assume is that an indigenous death investigation is pretty inadequate or largely inadequate to a non-indigenous investigation. And this, we see the same for different marginalized communities, Black communities, Latinx communities, things like that. But what I'm finding in my research, especially in Canada, that has this large conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit individuals, is that the death investigations are inadequate and that they're not getting the same standards that everyone else gets. So most of the time, if an Indigenous family member calls the police to say, my daughter's missing, they'll say, oh, you got to wait 24 hours and then maybe we'll go look into it. But we find that the standard practices are that they don't have to wait 24 hours. So we
Mhm.
should just go and find that person now. There's also, misconduct for finding evidence. Well, we find a lot of cases where police or coroners will just say, well, this is probably an accident or a suicide right off the bat, making some generalizations about what they're expecting Indigenous death to look like, and then they won't actually conduct a full investigation and collect all the evidence. They'll just process it. So a lot of it is that we have a lot of these families who have these same exact experiences. All these Indigenous families are like, we didn't get an actual investigation. They just kind of picked something for us and moved on. And conversation stops there. And we're trying to get that going so we can actually see some changes on that, some accountability.
Yeah, my goodness, that sound, that's obviously awful. I mean, just
Right, right.
where is it just racism? Is it a lack of support? Like the police are hired to cover X amount of people and indigenous people are thought of as other in some sense. What do you think is the reason?
So there's a variety of different explanations, I think, that I could talk about for days, honestly. But I see three primary contenders, and there's of course many others. But racism is definitely like first and foremost. But we need more research to be able to make a connection to those things, compare non-Indigenous cases. First and foremost, one, because we know Canada and North America police have a very complicated and problematic relationship with the Indigenous population, other marginalized populations as well. The second one is that the standards themselves for death investigation are problematic because they don't actually help Indigenous cases. A lot of them make assumptions about how one of the standard practices for law enforcement is generally when you go and talk to the family, give the death notification that their loved one has died. you bring a couple officers with you, maybe a victim services person. But for an indigenous population, most people are hesitant to have police in their home. That's not necessarily a welcoming, comforting thing. So second one is that the standards themselves are inadequate for indigenous people. And so changing those standards would probably help. It's not the whole part. And then the third one is that indigenous people have, for good reasons, don't trust the police to handle these things because they have quite the tumultuous relationship.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So
Well, I'm
it's a very
curious.
complex situation.
Yeah, I'd imagine. My goodness. But just so I understand a little bit better, say standards of an investigation. So, is there sort of like a playbook and or a checklist that someone who is, I don't know how to accurately describe a person, just a person who is a citizen of, another group outside of indigenous populations, that then doesn't apply to indigenous populations?
So the problem with that, this is where a lot of my master's research goes into right now. So I'm so glad that you asked it, is that there are standard procedures that say the police, any law enforcement, or like coroners, so investigators for the whole death investigation. There are standard practices and guidelines that they have, but they're not publicly accessible. So I, as a researcher, I don't have access to most of these. The indigenous families don't, legal reviewers or advocates don't, only those actual bodies that have them. So a lot of the conversation is, well, how can we say if these things are inadequate or your misconduct doesn't meet standards if you won't tell us what the standards are? And of
That's
course,
very bizarre.
Right, exactly.
I don't know if Canada has the US equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act, but that feels like something that should be clear, that everyone should understand.
Yeah, we have a freedom of information in Canada, but a lot of families that apply for these things, usually their response is, if the case is still technically open, then it doesn't apply. So the investigators are going to say, we can't give you that information, even if you filed a freedom of information, because the investigation's still open and we don't want to give out potentially incriminating evidence or whatever that could hinder that. But, they can say that for anything. It might be open just because they don't want to give out the information, not because they're actually actively investigating it.
Right. I see their side in that, right? There technically could be, it's just like a gray area of and what contributes to the discussion being so complex. But it's also incredibly frustrating at the same time, because how do you help a situation without knowing the rules which people are operating by?
Yeah, you're playing a very complex and problematic board game, but nobody gave you any of the instructions.
Like trying to play Monopoly from scratch without understanding anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I certainly hope that, your research bears fruit and you're able to help people, because this is something that I've never really heard of, and that's obviously a very big issue, that, should be getting the same standard of policing and support that anyone should get.
Exactly. Yeah, I hope so too. Gonna keep pushing it until hopefully something comes.
Well, that's great. One last question for you. So I have a podcast about death, and at times I feel weighed down. I feel like that right now, kind of in this moment. It just, as a subject matter, can be really heavy, and you're, I have a full-time job outside of this and other pursuits. How do you manage mentally thinking about death so often? I mean, not only are you thinking about death, you're thinking about people who are being left out, and not, that has another additional aspect of heaviness. So wondering how you sort of handle all that.
Yeah, so it's definitely a tricky one, and there's no right answer to any things that, I work with so many people who also have worked with the deceased in very gruesome investigations for decades. But personally, I try to get out of the house as much as I can. So detach myself physically from all of the situations. But I have the benefit of living in beautiful Vancouver in Canada, which is quite sunny at the moment. So try to detach myself from all of the grisly and death and depressing and sort of things, and going out and spending time with my community. Or luckily we haven't heard her meow, but the cat in the house or something like that. So the physical detachment, but also what I've learned, because I worked with mortuaries when I was like 18 all the way up to now. So I've worked with it for so long, it's sort of become a practiced thing where I mentally have to say, these things are horrible. And instead of just kind of being bogged down by depressive elements of those, saying, I can turn this into something that might be supportive or could be uplifting to someone else. So I kind of ride on the coattails of there's someone else who needs me to just kind of do this for them. And that's how I go through it. So,
Well,
yeah.
that's beautiful and inspiring. The times that I get messages through the Death Space Instagram, and at times, it's people telling me that they themselves are a ghost, which is tough to take seriously. But then there's also people that tell me their stories of grief and thank and feel seen by the podcast. And so that, I guess, similarly, I feel that I started this to help people, and when
Yeah.
people share that they got something from it, it just it reinvigorates and warms my heart. So that's beautiful that you share that sentiment, and yeah, that's
And I
amazing.
think honestly, like, you're doing a great thing for these individuals, because being able to normalize talking about these things or hearing other people express that they're also not feeling great but getting through the process, I think that's very important
Yeah.
just for anyone to be able to access to. So I'm really glad that you're talking about these things, because I know at like a dinner table we'll start talking about death and people are like, no, I can't handle that. So
Yeah.
just to
Well,
normalize
I
this
was
conversation.
that person, and I started this to, I, I want to say selfishly, but I don't think it's selfish, to help myself by talking to people. And it's sort of, I feel very different, even 12 episodes in. Talking about things that make you uncomfortable is just a general good thing for life, I think.
Yeah, complete agreement. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you feel like we should touch upon? Anything about the study, or what you're studying?
I think generally, I guess we have just to pay accolades, as we're both talking about everyone who's having to go through things that are very difficult and working through them to help everyone else. And just accolades to my research team and people at Simon Fraser. We just got funding for our research in general through, I think they're called the Social Sciences of Human Research Council through SFU. Just got funding, and it made a huge difference for us.
That's great.
We can continue
Congratulations.
our research for years. Thank you. Yeah, our research team was overjoyed in that moment, which you don't get a lot when you talk about death all the time.
Yeah.
So joy, right? But we also, we have dedicated people. We have all of our research assistants and our work study people who luckily connected to you and got this very cool talk going. So yeah, just like to pay accolades to them. Hopefully they're listening somewhere. But
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Steph, thank you so much for your time. I wish you and your research team all the best. And yeah, maybe we'll check in once you have some findings in either the study itself or what you're studying in terms of criminology. I think that would be great.
I would love that. That sounds amazing. Definitely.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
Man, it's so interesting and difficult to hear about how it's possible certain communities aren't getting the same investigations that others might. Thank you so much to Steff for sharing about the indigenous communities and the studies as well. If you're interested in taking the studies, I'm definitely going to post them on Death Space Filling the Voids social. Well, yeah, I mentioned in this podcast that I recently lost my grandfather. I was trying to decide when to mention it on the podcast. It kind of just came up organically. Probably going to do a little bit of an interview about that because, of course, it's hard. So we will see. I'd also like to mention my other podcast, That Gives Me Anxiety. It's a little bit lighter. It's looking at anxiety and the things that scare us and mostly we come to a conclusion that things aren't as scary as we think, and anxiety is something that we can manage a bit better. So certainly good news there. Well, all right, everyone. Enjoy your 4th of July. Be safe with the fireworks, but still have a lot of fun. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next Thursday.